The crystal glasses clinked as Secretary of State Marco Rubio entered La Maison Dorée, Washington's most exclusive restaurant. All eyes turned to him, some with admiration, others with curiosity, but none watched more intently than Elena Vasquez, a waitress whose trembling hands betrayed her nervousness. Tonight was supposed to be like any other shift, serving the political elite with a practiced smile, but fate had other plans when she spotted the man whose policies had directly impacted her immigrant family. The restaurant's golden chandeliers cast shadows across her face as she made a split-second decision that would change both their lives forever. The maitre d' escorted Secretary Rubio to the best table in the house, positioned perfectly under the magnificent central chandelier. Eleanor observed his confident stride, the way other diners nodded respectfully in his direction, and the deference shown by the staff. The restaurant hummed with hushed conversations and the gentle clinking of fine china and crystal. Elena had worked at La Maison Dorée for 3 years, saving every penny for her college education while supporting her younger siblings. Her father had been deported during a previous administration's immigration crackdown, tearing their family apart and forcing Elena to become the primary provider at just 19 years old. Every night, she served politicians who debated immigration policies over $200 bottles of wine, seemingly oblivious to the real people affected by their decisions. Tonight, Secretary Rubio's presence stirred something deep within her, a mix of anger, determination, and an unexpected opportunity to be heard. Elena approached his table with practiced grace, her spine straight and her expression carefully neutral despite the storm brewing inside her. Secretary Rubio was dining with 2 other men in expensive suits, their conversation flowing easily as they discussed international treaties and diplomatic relations. Elena introduced herself as their server for the evening, reciting the chef's specials with perfect pronunciation of the French dishes. Secretary Rubio barely looked up from his menu, acknowledging her with only a slight nod as he continued his conversation. This small dismissal was the final spark Elena needed. As she poured water into his glass, her hand trembled slightly, but her resolve solidified. Before leaving to place their orders, she made a decision that would either cost her this job or create a moment of truth that had been years in the making. When Eleanor returned with their appetizers, she approached Secretary Rubio with conflicting emotions swirling within her. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade as she carefully placed his plate before him, then paused longer than professionally appropriate. Secretary Rubio finally looked up, meeting her gaze with a questioning expression. Elena took a deep breath and spoke clearly enough for the entire table to hear, though not loud enough to cause a scene. She told him her name again, this time, adding that she was the daughter of Manuel Vasquez, deported 3 years ago despite living in the United States for 25 years, paying taxes and raising American children. The words tumbled out as she described how her family had been torn apart, how she had abandoned her college dreams to support her siblings, and how she served politicians every night who never saw the human cost of their policies. The restaurant seemed to freeze as Secretary Rubio's companions shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Elena finished by asking if Secretary Rubio could enjoy his $75 appetizer, knowing the human impact of immigration policies he had supported throughout his career. The silence that followed felt eternal. Other diners had begun to notice the unusual interaction, and Elena could see the maitre d' approaching from the corner of her eye. Secretary Rubio's face registered shock, then something unreadable as he placed his napkin beside his plate. Elena braced herself for outrage, for demands that she be fired immediately, for security to escort her from the premises. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The maitre d' had reached the table now, his expression a mixture of horror and apology as he began to stammer out excuses for her behavior. Secretary Rubio raised his hand slightly, silencing the flustered maître d' without taking his eyes off Elena. What happened next would be reported in newspapers across the country and discussed on every political talk show for weeks to come. Instead of anger, Secretary Rubio's expression softened. He asked Elena to sit down, gesturing to the empty chair at their table. The maître d' looked scandalized, but retreated when Secretary Rubio assured him everything was fine. Elena hesitated, certain this was some kind of trap, but slowly lowered herself into the chair, her uniform suddenly feeling inadequate among these powerful men. Secretary Rubio introduced his companions, a senator and a foreign diplomat, then asked Elena to tell her family's story again, this time from the beginning. As she spoke, he listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about her father's case, their legal representation, and specific details about the deportation process. His companions remained silent, watching this unexpected scene unfold with clear discomfort. Elena found herself revealing details she had never shared with anyone outside her family. The midnight raid, the denied appeals, the final tearful goodbye at the detention center. As she finished her story, she realized tears were streaming down her face, but she felt no shame, only a strange sense of relief at finally being heard. The restaurant had grown eerily quiet, the other diners pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Secretary Rubio reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, writing a personal number on the back. He explained that while he couldn't promise miracles, he believed her father's case deserved review, especially given his long residency and family ties. Immigration reform had always been complex, he admitted, often caught between competing interests and political realities. Elena was stunned by his candor as he acknowledged that policymakers sometimes lost sight of individual stories like hers. The human element could get buried under statistics and partisan debates. He asked Elena for her contact information and promised to have his staff look into her father's case first thing in the morning. The senator at the table, initially uncomfortable, now joined the conversation, offering his office's assistance. As well, Elena felt a surreal sense of disbelief. Was this really happening, or would these promises evaporate once she walked away from the table? The maître d' hovered anxiously nearby, clearly torn between restaurant protocol and the unusual situation unfolding at his most prominent table. Other waitstaff had taken over Elena's duties, serving the men their main courses as she remained seated with them. Secretary Rubio surprised everyone again by inviting Elena to join them for dinner, an invitation she politely declined, aware of crossing too many boundaries already. As she stood to return to work, Secretary Rubio made one final statement that rippled through the restaurant. In a clear voice that carried to nearby tables, he thanked Elena for her courage, stating that democracy functioned best when citizens held their representatives accountable. He promised not only to look into her father's specific case, but to use her story as a reminder of the human impact of policy decisions in his diplomatic work. The sincerity in his voice made Elena pause, wondering if she had misjudged him all these years, or if this was simply skilled political damage control. Elena returned to work with a strange mixture of hope and skepticism. The restaurant buzzed with whispers as diners discussed what they had witnessed. Some guests approached Elena discreetly, expressing support or sharing their own immigration stories. Others seemed disapproving, muttering about appropriate workplace behavior. Her manager called her aside, his expression stern as he lectured her about professional conduct and respecting guests' privacy, regardless of their public status. Elena listened silently, expecting to be fired on the spot. To her surprise, he concluded by saying that Secretary Rubio had specifically requested that there be no repercussions for her actions. Elena's colleagues regarded her with a mixture of awe and concern as she continued her shift, the business card burning a hole in her pocket. She wondered if the promises made would materialize or fade with the morning light. The number seemed both a lifeline and a cruel trick. How many political promises had been broken before? 2 weeks passed, and Elena had heard nothing. The initial media buzz about the restaurant confrontation had died down, though La Maison Doré had seen an uptick in reservations from curious diners, hoping to glimpse the now famous waitress. Elena had called the number Secretary Rubio provided once, reaching only a voicemail where she left a hesitant message. Her hope had begun to wane, reinforcing her belief that the sympathetic response had been merely for show. Her siblings asked daily if there was any news, their young faces bright with a hope she could no longer share. Eleanor had begun to regret the entire encounter, wondering if she had jeopardized her job for nothing. On a rainy Tuesday evening, as she prepared for another shift, her phone rang with an unfamiliar Washington, D.C. number. Her heart raced as she answered, hearing the formal voice of a government official asking to speak with Elena Vasquez regarding the case of Manuel Vasquez. The call lasted 23 minutes, during which Elena sank to her knees in her small apartment, tears streaming down her face. The official explained that Secretary Rubio had personally reviewed her father's case with the Department of Homeland Security. Given Manuel's long residency, clean criminal record, tax payment history, and American children, they had found grounds to revisit his deportation order. The process would take time, the official cautioned, but they were initiating proceedings that could potentially allow her father to return to the United States under a humanitarian visa. Elena could barely speak, managing only to ask if this was really happening. The official assured her that while there were no guarantees, Secretary Rubio had made this case a priority and would continue to monitor its progress. As the call ended, Elena sat in stunned silence, the rain pattering against her window as the impossible suddenly seemed possible. Her younger siblings found her there minutes later, still clutching the phone, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't yet articulate. News of Manuel Vasquez's case review spread quickly through media channels, igniting fresh debates about immigration policy and political accountability. Elena found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight, with journalists requesting interviews and political commentators analyzing her restaurant confrontation from every angle. Critics called it a publicity stunt by Secretary Rubio, while supporters praised his compassionate response. Elena declined most interview requests, uncomfortable with the attention and wary of saying anything that might jeopardize her father's case. Secretary Rubio's office maintained diplomatic discretion, releasing only a brief statement acknowledging that the case was under review based on its specific merits. Elena continued working at La Maison Doré, where she was now something of an attraction. Some diners requested her section specifically, while others asked to be seated far from her. Through it all, she maintained a dignified silence, focusing on the possibility of her family's reunion rather than the swirling political storm. 6 months later, Elena stood nervously at Washington Dulles International Airport, her siblings fidgeting excitedly beside her. Secretary Rubio had called personally the week before, informing her that her father had been granted a humanitarian visa and would be arriving on Saturday morning. The immigration process had been expedited through special channels, something critics were quick to point out was unavailable to most families in similar situations. Elena had mixed feelings about the special treatment, but couldn't deny her gratitude and joy at the prospect of seeing her father again. As passengers began streaming through the arrival gates, Elena spotted Secretary Rubio standing discreetly to one side with a small security detail. Their eyes met briefly across the terminal, and he gave her a simple nod of acknowledgement. Elena nodded back, a silent exchange that acknowledged the complicated reality of their unexpected connection. When Manuel Vasquez finally appeared, thin and graying but smiling broadly, Elena and her siblings rushed forward into his embrace, 3 years of separation dissolving in tears of joy. The reunion became the closing chapter of a story that had captured national attention. Photographs of the family embrace appeared in newspapers alongside images of Secretary Rubio watching from a respectful distance. In the weeks that followed, Secretary Rubio announced a new initiative to review similar cases of family separation, emphasizing the need for immigration policies that balanced security concerns with humanitarian considerations. Critics called it political opportunism, while supporters praised it as responsive governance. Elena's family kept a low profile, focusing on rebuilding their life together, rather than engaging with the political narrative surrounding them. Manuel found work as a maintenance supervisor at a local community center, while Elena finally returned to college, her family now stable enough for her to pursue her long-deferred dreams. The story gradually faded from headlines, but its impact continued in quieter ways throughout Washington's political circles. 1 year after their airport reunion, Elena graduated with her associate degree in political science. As she crossed the stage to receive her diploma, she spotted a familiar face in the audience. Secretary Rubio had come without announcement or fanfare, sitting in the back row. After the ceremony, he approached the family, congratulating Elena and inquiring about Manuel's adjustment back to American life. The conversation was brief but genuine, without cameras or press releases. Before leaving, Secretary Rubio mentioned a new bipartisan immigration reform bill being drafted, stating that stories like theirs had helped shape certain humanitarian provisions. Manuel shook his hand with the dignity of a man who had suffered much but maintained his humanity. As Secretary Rubio walked away, Elena realized that their unlikely encounter had changed them both. What had begun as a moment of public humiliation had evolved into something neither could have predicted. A reminder that beyond political divisions and policy debates, the human capacity for listening and compassion could still bridge seemingly insurmountable divides, occasionally transforming individual lives and perhaps even systems themselves.